In the previous video, we discovered the extraordinary story of Anta, the young shaman of the Falcon tribe who became Montano, one of the most powerful warriors in vampiric history. But how many of you wondered, what was the Africa that witnessed the birth of this legendary character really like? What kind of civilization produced such a remarkable leader that even an immortal being thousands of years old recognized his greatness? The history you learned in school probably skipped this part. Perhaps it mentioned Egypt, then jumped straight to European colonization, as if between these 2 points there was only a void of thousands of years. But the truth is very different and far more fascinating. Today, we're going to dive into the African civilizations that official history preferred to forget. We'll discover kingdoms that built cities larger than medieval London, that developed political systems more sophisticated than Europeans of the same era, and that accumulated wealth that would make the most powerful kings in the world blush. And we'll start exactly where Montano was born, in the lands around Mount Kilimanjaro, in the heart of East Africa. Because to understand how a leader of that magnitude emerged, we need to understand the cradle that formed him. When Anta was born, around the 1st century after Christ, the Mount Kilimanjaro region was very different from what you imagine when you think of tribal Africa. Forget the simplistic images that Hollywood planted in your head. What existed there was something much more complex and sophisticated. Anta's Falcon tribe was part of an immense mosaic of Bantu peoples who had migrated to East Africa during previous centuries. This Bantu migration was one of the largest population movements in human history, involving millions of people over more than 1,000 years. And it wasn't a desperate flight or a violent invasion. It was a planned, gradual expansion, carrying with it advanced technologies that completely transformed the region. The Bantu peoples brought 3 revolutionary innovations that changed East Africa forever. First, iron metallurgy. While many European historians still debate how iron reached Africa, the archaeological truth is undeniable. Africans were smelting high-quality iron in sophisticated furnaces as early as the 1st millennium before Christ. Some specialists, such as Professor Bassey Andah of the University of Ibadan, argue that African metallurgy developed independently without external influence. Evidence at sites like Nowaki in Nigeria, dated to 800 years before Christ, supports this theory. Second, innovation, advanced agriculture. The Bantu were not simple farmers. They developed complex systems of crop rotation, irrigation, and storage that allowed them to feed dense populations even in challenging regions. They cultivated sorghum, millet, yams, and an impressive variety of legumes. Arab documents from the 9th century describe East African markets with an abundance of food that left visitors impressed. Third, revolution, complex social organization. Tribes like the Falcon were not disorganized nomadic bands. They were structured societies with sophisticated political systems, hierarchies based on merit and age, deliberative councils, and even primitive forms of democracy. Anthropologist Cheikh, Anta Diop of the University of Dakar extensively documented how these societies functioned based on principles of consensus and representation that would only reach Europe centuries later. But the most important thing for our story is understanding the role of shamans in these societies. The shaman was not simply a healer or a priest. He was the guardian of knowledge in a culture without writing. The shaman memorized thousands of years of oral history, medicinal techniques, astronomy, meteorology, and philosophy. He was simultaneously scientist, historian, physician, political advisor, and spiritual leader. When the Montano case documents mention that Anta was being trained as a shaman from the age of 6, this meant he was receiving the most complete and rigorous education available in his society. More complete, in fact, than the education of many European nobles of the same period. Shamanic training lasted decades and required memorization of colossal amounts of information, mastery of complex trance and altered consciousness techniques, deep knowledge of botany and natural pharmacology, and development of leadership and counseling skills. Young Anta was being prepared to be one of the most important men in his tribe, and this explains much about the character he would become. His capacity for rapid learning, his precocious wisdom, his understanding of psychological tactics, all of this came from years of intensive training in humanity's oldest shamanic traditions. Now, to fully understand Montano's context, we need to look at what was happening in the rest of Africa during that period, because the Africa of the 1st century after Christ was not an isolated continent. It was a global center of trade, knowledge, and power. While Anta was growing up on the slopes of Kilimanjaro to the north, the kingdom of Kush dominated the Nile with a sophistication that rivaled Rome. Kush was not a minor kingdom or a vassal of Egypt, as some textbooks suggest. It was a superpower. The capital of Kushmaru had something that left Roman visitors speechless: more pyramids than Egypt itself. While the Egyptians had built about 120 pyramids throughout their history, Kush built more than 220. And they were not cheap imitations. They were unique structures, steeper and more elegant than the Egyptian ones, reflecting a distinctly Kushite architectural aesthetic. But the pyramids were just the tip of the iceberg. Meroë was an impressive industrial center. Archaeologists have found evidence of dozens of iron foundries operating simultaneously. The amount of slag iron smelting waste found in Meroë is so large that some specialists call it the Birmingham of ancient Africa. Professor Amilcar Cabral of the University of London estimates that Kush produced thousands of tons of iron annually, and industrial production comparable to that of medieval Europe a millennium later. And there was more. Kush had its own writing Meroitic script. To this day, we have not been able to fully decipher it, but we know it was a unique system, not derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs. They created their own alphabet with 23 signs used for both sacred texts and daily administration. Imagine the intellectual sophistication necessary to invent a complete writing system. Kush maintained diplomatic and commercial relations with Rome, Persia, India, and even China via indirect trade routes. When the Roman Emperor Augustus tried to conquer Kush, he failed miserably. The Kushite queen Amanirenas personally led her armies, lost an eye in combat, but defeated the Roman legions and forced Rome to sign a peace treaty on terms favorable to Kush. Very few peoples in history can say they faced Rome at its peak and won. Going south, we have the kingdom of Axum in present-day Ethiopia. Axum was so powerful that the Prophet Muhammad, centuries later, instructed his followers never to attack it. Why? Because Axum had given refuge to the first Muslims persecuted in Mecca. But Axum was more than benevolent. It was brutal when necessary. In the 4th century after Christ, Axum completely destroyed Kush. King Azana of Axum left an inscription in stone, still preserved, describing his military campaign. He mobilized massive armies, sailed the Nile with war fleets, and razed Kushite cities one by one. It was not a conquest. It was a systematic annihilation. Axum also minted its own gold coins, a definitive sign of economic and political power in the ancient world. Only the most powerful empires minted gold coins. Rome did, Persia did, Axum did, and its coins circulated throughout the Indian Ocean, accepted in markets from India to the Mediterranean. Axumite architecture was spectacular. They built gigantic obelisks, the largest of them 33 meters high and weighing 520 tons, cut and raised from a single piece of granite. How? With engineering techniques so advanced that modern engineers still debate the exact methods. Further west, meanwhile, the Empire of Ghana was beginning to emerge. Ghana, not to be confused with the modern country of the same name, controlled the trans-Saharan gold routes. And when I say gold, I'm not talking about occasional nuggets. Arab documents from the 8th century describe Ghana caravans with up to 12,000 camels, carrying gold, ivory, and salt. 12,000 camels? A single caravan. The king of Ghana was so rich that when he gave public audiences, even his dog wore a gold collar. This is not legend. It is documented by Arab historians who visited the kingdom. The geographer al-Bakri, writing in the 11th century, describes a court where guards carried swords and shields decorated with gold. Horses had gold bridles, and even the chains that tied the horses were gold. Ghana had a tax system so efficient that it completely controlled the gold trade. All gold extracted in the empire had to pass through the king. Nuggets belonged to the king. Only gold dust could be freely traded. Why? To keep the price high by controlling supply. This is sophisticated economics. This is understanding of global markets. And it doesn't stop there. Ghana had an army of 200,000 warriors, of which 40,000 were archers. To put it in perspective, when William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he had about 7,000 men. Ghana's army was almost 30 times larger. These were not primitive kingdoms. They were global powers with complex economies, powerful militaries, sophisticated administrations, and rich cultures, and they all existed simultaneously, competing, trading, warring, diplomating with each other. So when the vampire La Sambra arrived in the Kilimanjaro region looking for powerful people with strong bodies, great courage, and a sense of honor, he was not looking in a land of savages. He was looking in a continent of empires. But let's go beyond politics and war. Let's talk about knowledge, because this is where official history most fails to recognize African greatness. Ancient Africa had universities. Yes, complete universities with structured curricula, specialized professors, and thousands of students. The most famous was Sankore in Timbuktu, founded in the 12th century. But there were many others scattered across the continent. Sankore had 25,000 students. 25,000. For comparison, the University of Oxford, founded at the same time, had a few hundred. Sankore taught mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, physics, music, art, and, of course, Islamic theology. But it was not just Islamic. It also preserved knowledge from ancient African religions, translated Greek texts, Indian and Persian knowledge. The Sankore Library had between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts. 400,000. Many of them hand-illuminated, some with gold leaf. When Europeans finally reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, they were shocked. They could not believe that African savages could have produced something so refined. In medicine, Africans were centuries ahead of Europe in many areas. They performed cataract surgery successfully when Europeans still thought vision problems were divine punishments. They performed cesarean sections with herbal anesthesia and suturing techniques that minimized infections, documented by 19th century European explorers who watched, horrified and impressed, procedures that saved mother and baby in situations where European doctors would have let both die. African pharmacological knowledge was vast. Shamans like Anta knew hundreds of medicinal plants and their applications. Many modern medicines derive from plants that Africans had been using for millennia. Quinine, which saved millions of lives from malaria, came from African medicinal knowledge. Resorpine, used to treat hypertension and mental disorders. 2. In metallurgy, Africans developed unique techniques. Damascus steel, famous for its superior quality and capable of cutting silk in the air, was made with African iron. Wootz, the very high-quality steel used in the best swords of the medieval world, came partly from African mines and was processed using techniques partly based on African knowledge transmitted via trade routes. But there is something even more impressive. Mathematics. Africans developed complex mathematical systems independently. The Ishango people of the Congo used marked bones for mathematical calculations 20,000 years ago. This is older than any known mathematics anywhere else in the world. The Ishango bone, discovered in 1960, shows understanding of prime numbers and multiplication. West Africans used a binary system, zeros and ones, long before computers, long before Leibniz invented the binary system in Europe. They used it for divination, but the mathematical principle was identical. Anthropologists Run Iglash demonstrated how fractal patterns, extremely advanced geometry, appear in traditional African architecture from villages to cities. Fractals that European mathematicians only began to understand in the 20th century. In astronomy, Africans mapped the stars with impressive precision. The Dogon people of Mali knew about Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye centuries before modern telescopes discovered it in 80. How did they know? That is one of the great mysteries still debated, but they knew. They described its 50-year orbit, its extreme density. All correct. African farmers domesticated unique crops: sorghum, African millet, fonio, African yams, palm oil, coffee. Coffee, the drink that moves the modern world, is African, from Ethiopia specifically. And Africans developed cultivation techniques so efficient that when Europeans tried to replicate them in their colonies, they often failed because they did not understand the underlying ecological principles. In hydraulic engineering, African kingdoms built massive irrigation systems. Great Zimbabwe, we'll talk more about it in a moment, had a drainage system so well designed that its stone structures, built without mortar, remained stable for more than 1,000 years in a region of intense rainfall. In architecture, the walls of Benin, in present-day Nigeria, were longer than the Great Wall of China when you add up all its segments. 1,600 kilometers of walls, moats, and defensive ditches. The Guinness Book of Records recognized them as the largest pre-mechanical earthwork structure ever built. Ditches up to 20 meters deep and walls up to 12 meters high. All of this excavated and built before modern machinery. African cities were planned with wide streets, sewage systems, and organized residential zones. Great Zimbabwe had more than 18,000 inhabitants at its peak, a metropolis by medieval standards. Its stone walls were so well built that when Europeans discovered them, they refused to believe that Africans had built them. They invented absurd theories that Phoenicians, Arabs, Even aliens built them. Anyone but Africans. Why? Racism, pure and simple. But archaeology does not lie. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, for Africans, using African techniques, and it was one of the architectural wonders of the medieval world. So when we talk about Anta's training as a shaman, we are not talking about primitive superstitions. We are talking about an educational system that transmitted knowledge of medicine, botany, astronomy, history, mathematics, psychology, meteorology, and philosophy, accumulated over millennia. Anta was receiving a world-class education. Now let's make some direct comparisons that will shock you. When Anta was born in the 1st century after Christ, the population of Rome was about 1 million inhabitants. Impressive, right? But some African cities in this period had comparable populations, and over the following centuries, while Rome was collapsing, African cities continued to grow. In the 14th century, when Montano was already an established vampire, Timbuktu had between 50,000 and 100,000 inhabitants. At that same time, London had about 50,000, Paris had about 200,000, but Timbuktu was not alone. Cairo had 500,000, Kilwa, on the east coast of Africa, had between 20,000 and 30,000 inhabitants living in multi-story stone houses, something most European cities did not have in wealth. Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali in the 14th century, is often cited as the richest man who ever lived. Adjusting for inflation, his fortune is estimated at 400 billion modern dollars. When he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, he took 60,000 companions and distributed so much gold that he devalued the price of gold in Egypt for a decade. 1 decade. One man alone destabilized the regional economy just by being too generous. In education in the 12th century, while Europe was plunged into the Dark Ages, Timbuktu had more books available than any European city except perhaps Cordoba in Moorish Spain, which, interesting note, owes part of its greatness to North African influence and the legacy. All of this was systematically erased or minimized. Why? Because it was convenient for European colonizers to paint Africans as primitive. It justified slavery. It justified colonization. If you admit that Africans had civilizations as advanced as European ones, suddenly it becomes much harder to justify treating them as subhuman. But truth always emerges. Today, archaeologists, historians, and scientists are rediscovering and reconstructing these stories. African universities, such as the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and the University of Dakar in Senegal, are leading research that completely rewrites what we know about African history. Professor Ali Mazrui said, "Africa is not just a cradle of humanity, it is a cradle of civilization." And he was absolutely right. Everything began in Africa, not just biologically, but culturally, technologically, intellectually. When you understand this, when you truly comprehend the depth and sophistication of African civilizations, Montano's story gains new layers. It is not just the story of a brave shaman. It is the story of a product of humanity's greatest intellectual and cultural traditions, facing a supernatural being and winning through wisdom, courage, and honor, fundamental values of the African societies that created him. So why does this story matter? Why spend almost 20 minutes talking about ancient African kingdoms on a channel about vampiric mysteries? Because context is everything. When you understand where Montano came from, when you comprehend that he was a product of one of the world's richest educational traditions. When you realize that he grew up in a continent of powerful empires and vast knowledge, you understand why a vampire thousands of years old chose him. La Sombra was not looking for just any warrior. He was looking for the best. And he found him in an Africa that Hollywood and textbooks prefer to forget. The story of Africa is the story of humanity. It is our story, and it is time we tell it right. If you want to understand more about how real historical characters intertwine with these legends, if you want to discover more secrets that official history hid, subscribe to the channel. We have an entire playlist about forgotten civilizations, about legendary warriors, about the lost knowledge of ancient peoples. And leave in the comments, which African civilization would you like us to explore next? The Songhai Empire, the Kingdom of Congo, the Swahili cities of the East Coast. Your comments guide our next videos, because this is just the first layer. There is so much more to discover, so much more to understand. And we are just beginning. Until the next revelation.